Lenora Wynn's hands were still covered in blood when the night finally let her go. She stood on the back porch of Nell Greer's boarding house with a rag pressed between her palms, working the dark stains out of the creases around her knuckles, while inside the house, Anna Patterson wept with a joy so pure and so complete that it filled every room and leaked through every crack in the walls and drifted out into the June darkness, like music from a church where the doors had been left open. The baby had come just before midnight, a boy, 8 pounds of furious, perfect life, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to every sleeping soul within a quarter-mile of Copper Bend's main street. Lenora had done everything right. She always did everything right. Her hands had found the child in the warm passage of his mother's body and guided him into the lamplight with the steady precision that had become her signature over 7 years of practice in this dying mining town in the Colorado mountains. 43 successful deliveries. She kept count because the numbers were proof that her hands could give life even if she could never hold it for herself. Inside, Anna laughed. Not the strained, half-delirious laughter of a woman still riding the final waves of labor, but the deep, astonished laughter of someone who cannot believe the weight of what she is holding. Lenora knew the sound. She had heard it 43 times. Each time it cut a little deeper. Each time the blade found new tissue that had not yet scarred over from the last. Nella Greer appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. She was 60 years old with silver hair loose around her shoulders and reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead, where they served no purpose except to remind everyone that Nell Greer did whatever she pleased with her belongings, including wearing them in the wrong place. Beautiful boy. Nell held out one of the cups. You did good work tonight. I always do good work. That ain't what I meant, and you know it. Lenora took the coffee but did not drink it. She wrapped both hands around the ceramic and let the heat burn against her palms, replacing one kind of warmth with another. The blood was mostly gone, now faded to a pale rust color in the lines of her knuckles, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. But Lenora was always looking for it. She had been looking for it on her hands for 7 years, the way a woman who has survived a flood keeps watching the river even after the water has gone down. You gonna stand out here all night? Nell asked. Just catching my breath. You're lying, Lenora Wynn. You've been catching your breath for 7 years. At some point, a woman's got to start breathing again. Lenora turned to look at her. Nell Greer was the only person in Copper Bend who knew the whole truth. Not the polished version Lenora offered when pressed, the version about wanting a quieter life, about preferring the mountains to the noise and the crowds of the East. Nell knew the real story, the blood and the blame, and the 2 small bodies that had passed through Lenora's hands and into the silence that exists on the other side of breathing. The silence that had followed Lenora across 3 states and settled into her bones like winter settling into a house with no fire. I breathe just fine, Lenora said. You survived just fine. That ain't the same thing, and any woman past 50 knows the difference. Inside the room, Anna Patterson laughed again. The sound moved through Lenora like a blade drawn slowly across something that had never properly healed. She had heard that exact quality of laughter before, not from her own throat. Never from her own throat. She had been the one holding the child that would not cry, the one counting seconds that stretched into minutes, that stretched into a silence so complete it swallowed every sound she had ever known or expected to know again. I'm going home. Lenora picked up her leather medical bag from the porch rail. It was scarred and softened by 7 years of mountain weather, the brass clasps tarnished green at the edges. She had carried it across 3 states and through 2 lifetimes. It was the only thing she owned that had been with her since Philadelphia. It's past midnight. At least wait till morning. The walk will do me good. Nell caught her arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fingers pressing into the muscle above Lenora's elbow with the firm insistence of someone who had earned the right to hold on by years of watching and worrying and keeping secrets that were not hers to tell, but too heavy for one woman to carry alone. Lenora, one of these days you're going to have to stop punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Lenora gently pulled free. Good night, Nell. She stepped off the porch and into the darkness, and the darkness received her the way it always did, without judgment, without questions, without the expectation that she smile or explain or pretend that walking home alone at midnight after placing another woman's child into another woman's arms was anything other than the quiet catastrophe it had been every single time for 7 years. The road from the boarding house to Lenora's cabin wound through the center of Copper Bend, a town that had seen better days and knew it the way a man knows his own reflection is aging, even when he tries not to look too long. The silver mine that had built this place was running thin. Everyone could feel it. The slow dying of a community that had once thrived on what the mountain gave up from its belly, now watching that belly go hollow, while the houses sagged and the storefronts gathered dust and the young men drifted away toward Denver and points east where the future still had a pulse. Lenora walked fast. She always walked fast when the grief came hunting. Her boots struck the packed dirt road with purpose, each step a small act of defiance against the thing that pursued her, and she kept her eyes straight ahead because looking at the houses on either side meant seeing the lives she had helped create but could never have for herself. The Parrish house. She had delivered Emmett Parrish, now 10 years old, 3 weeks after his father died in the mine. A cave in the third that year. Emmett had come into the world screaming with the full-throated fury of a child who already knew what had been taken from him, and Lenora had placed him in his mother Ada's arms and watched grief and joy collide in that young woman's face like two rivers meeting at the same falls. Ada had held her son and wept, and Lenora had cleaned her instruments and packed her bag and walked home in the dark with her fists clenched so tight her nails drew small crescents of blood from her palms. The Henderson place. Twin girls born breech, both feet first, tangled together like they were trying to hold on to each other instead of letting go of the only warmth they had ever known. Both surviving because Lenora had steady hands and a stubborn refusal to let death win when she was the one standing between its appetite and its meal. The Brennan house, where old Walt Brennan's grandson had come into the world, blue and silent, until Lenora cleared his throat with her little finger, and the boy gasped and screamed, and Walt had wept on the front porch with his hat in his hands. This barrel-chested miner, who had spent 30 years underground without shedding a tear, broken wide open by the sound of his own blood continuing. The Mitchells, the Burkes, the Carvers. Every family in Copper Bend owed her something, and not one of them could give her the thing she actually wanted. She was 35 years old. She had never been married, never been courted in any way that lasted beyond a single awkward supper or a dance at the 4th of July social, where some rancher's son would hold her waist too loosely, as if afraid she might break, or too tightly, as if afraid she might run. She had never been kissed. Not once, not the way it counted, not the way that changed the shape of a woman's mouth and the rhythm of her breathing and the entire geography of her expectations. It was not that Lenora Wynne was plain. She was not. She had dark hair that caught the light when she let it down, which she almost never did, and gray eyes that people described as striking when they were being kind and unsettling when they were being honest. Her face had the kind of angular beauty that would improve with age, rather than softened cheekbones that would still be worth looking at when she was 60. But there was something in the way she carried herself that kept the world at arm's length, a self-containment so complete it functioned as a wall. She did not lean toward people. She did not touch casually. She held her as medical bag against her body like a shield, and when she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes, as if the muscles that connected joy to expression had been severed somewhere along the road from Philadelphia, and she had never found the right instrument to stitch them back together. Philadelphia. The word still tasted like copper and formaldehyde. It tasted like the wax floors of a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, and the sound her shoes made walking away from a profession she had loved more than she had ever loved a person. The work had been everything. The work had been the closest thing to faith she had ever known. She had been 28 when it happened, an assistant to Dr. George Harlan, the finest obstetrician on the Eastern Seaboard, or so his diploma and his patients and his wife at dinner parties all agreed. Lenora had trained under him for 3 years. She had studied every text, attended every lecture, practiced every technique on the anatomical models until her hands could find a child's heartbeat through layers of flesh and fabric with her eyes closed. Dr. Harlan had called her gifted. He had called her the best pair of hands he had ever trained. She had believed him. She had believed that being good at something was a kind of armor that would protect her from the specific cruelty the world reserved for women who dared to be competent. Then came the night in October when she delivered her first baby alone. Dr. Harlan was at a conference in Boston. The mother was a banker's wife, young, healthy, terrified. The labor progressed normally until it did not. The umbilical cord wrapped around the baby's neck 3 times, coiled so tight that by the time Lenora unwound it, the child's face was the color of a bruise and the silence in the delivery room had a weight that pressed against her sternum like a fist. She worked for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of breathing into that tiny mouth, pressing her thumbs against that tiny chest, willing life into a body that had already decided to leave. The mother screamed, the nurses stood frozen, and Lenora held the dead child in her arms and felt something close inside her with the finality of a vault door swinging shut in a room where no one would ever hear her knock. Dr. Harlan returned from Boston. He reviewed the case. He stood in his office with his diploma behind him and his reputation in front of him, and he looked at Lenora with the calm, measuring eyes of a man who understood that blame was a currency that could be spent to purchase safety, and he told the hospital board that his assistant had acted without proper supervision and that the death was a result of her inexperience. She had been cleared of formal charges. The inquest found no negligence, but the word had already spread through the medical community like ink dropped into water, staining everything it touched. Lenora Wynne, the one who lost the baby. Doors that had been opened closed with a quietness that was worse than slamming. Colleagues who had smiled now looked past her in hallways. The banker's wife, who survived and would go on to have 3 more children with a different doctor, never spoke Lenora's name again. And the worst part was not the blame. The worst part was the doubt. Because in the darkest hours of every night that followed, Lenora replayed every second of that delivery with the relentless precision of a clockmaker examining a broken mechanism, and she could not be certain with the absolute certainty her profession demanded that there was nothing she could have done differently. The cord had been wrapped 3 times. She had unwound it in the correct sequence. She had cleared the airway. She had done everything. But the child was dead, and the child had been in her hands when it died. And no amount of procedural correctness could lift that weight from her palms. She packed her bag. She left Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning in March when the trees along Broad Street were still bare and the sky was the color of old pewter. The carriage that took her to the train station past the hospital where she had learned everything she knew and lost everything she had, and she did not look at it. She kept her eyes forward. She would keep them forward for the next 7 years. She traveled west with no destination. Only the desperate conviction that distance might function as a kind of forgetting if she covered enough of it. Somewhere in Kansas, on a stagecoach rattling through grassland that stretched to the edges of the earth, a woman in the seat beside her went into labor 2 months early. There was no doctor. There was no clinic. There was no clean room or boiled water or any of the instruments that separated medicine from prayer. There was only Lenora and her hands and a child so small it fit in a single palm, its skin translucent, its lungs too undeveloped to hold air, its eyes never opening. She held that baby for an hour on the floor of a moving stagecoach while the mother bled and the driver cursed and the Kansas prairie offered nothing in response but wind and distance and the vast indifference of a landscape that had watched a million things die without ever learning any of their names. 2 babies, 2 failures, 2 sets of tiny fingers that had curled around hers and then gone slack. She carried them in her body the way other women carried children, invisible to everyone who looked at her, but present in every step she took and every breath she drew. And every night she lay alone in the dark and felt the weight of small bodies that were no longer there pressing against her chest like stones laid upon a grave. Copper Bend had been an accident, a stop for water that turned into a week, that turned into a month, that turned into 7 years. The town needed a midwife. The previous one had died of pneumonia 2 winters before Lenora arrived, and in the gap between dying and replacement, 3 women had lost babies that might have lived if someone with trained hands had been in the room. Lenora needed a purpose that would keep the stones from crushing her. So she stayed, delivering other women's babies with hands she believed were cursed. Each successful delivery, a small proof that Philadelphia had been wrong about her. Each cry of a healthy newborn, a sound that both healed and wounded her in the same breath, because every child she saved was also a child she would hand to someone else, before walking home alone in the dark to a cabin where no one waited and no one called her name. And the only sound was the wind against the windows and the silence inside the walls. Her cabin appeared ahead, small and square and exactly as empty as she had left it. A single window faced the road, dark as a closed eye. The garden she had planted in May was growing well despite her neglect, tomatoes and herbs pushing through the mountain soil with the blind optimism of things that did not know they were alone. She was reaching for the door latch when she heard hoofbeats. They came down the mountain road heavy and deliberate at a pace that said the rider had purpose, but was not in a panic. Lenora turned. The horse came first, a massive black gelding with a chest like a barrel and legs thick as fence posts, the kind of animal that looked as though it had been assembled from parts of the mountain itself. Then the rider. And Lenora felt her breath stop the way it always did when Silas Cade came down from his ridge. He was the biggest man she had ever seen. 6 feet 4 inches of weathered muscle and quiet intention. Dark hair wild from wind, beard untrimmed, hands wrapped around the reins like they could crush stone if he ever found a reason. He wore no hat. Silas Cade never wore a hat, which the other ranchers found peculiar, and the women in town found secretly thrilling, though not one of them would have said so where their husbands could hear. He reined up 10 feet from her porch and did not dismount. The gelding blew steam into the cool mountain air and stamped once impatient, and the leather of the saddle creaked under Silas's weight like the rigging of a ship in heavy weather. "You're out late," Lenora said, because silence with Silas Cade felt dangerous in ways she did not want to examine. The kind of dangerous that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the alarming awareness that she noticed things about this man she had no business noticing. The width of his shoulders, the way his hands held the reins with a gentleness that contradicted their size. The fact that he never looked away first. "So are you," he said. "I was delivering a baby." "I know, that's why I'm here." Something cold moved through Lenora's chest. A premonition, a warning from the part of her brain that had learned to recognize the shape of a life about to change. "Is someone hurt up at your place? One of your hands?" "No." "Then why?" "I need to talk to you, Lenora." He had never called her by her first name before. In the 3 years she had been aware of his existence, he had been a figure at the edges of her life. Glimpsed at the general store, a nodded greeting at the Independence Day gathering. The one time he brought an injured ranch hand to her door and stood in the rain for 2 hours waiting without a single word of complaint or impatience. He had always called her Miss Wynne or ma'am, even after she had told him twice there was no need for formality. "It's midnight, Mr. Cade. I know what time it is. And you rode 2 hours down a mountain in the dark to talk to me." "Yes, ma'am." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. The gelding shifted beneath him, and the leather creaked. The moon was half full, and it threw silver light across the yard and turned the mountain behind him into a dark wall that looked like the edge of the known world. Then Silas Cade swung down from the saddle with a grace that should have been impossible for a man his size. A single fluid motion that brought all of him to the ground without a stumble. And he walked toward her porch with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was terrified of getting it wrong. He stopped at the bottom of her steps. Even standing below her, his eyes were nearly level with hers. "I need a wife," he said, flat and plain like stating the price of feed at the general store. No tremor, no hesitation, just the blunt declaration of a man who had weighed his words on a scale and found them sufficient. Lenora stared at him. "Excuse me, I need a wife, and you need—" He stopped, swallowed hard. Started again, and this time his voice came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere he did not let people hear. "You need a reason to stop delivering other women's babies while your own arms stay empty." The words hit her like a mule kick square in the chest. She actually stepped backward, her hand flying to the porch rail for balance. Nobody talked about that. Nobody in Copper Bend ever mentioned Lenora's empty cabin, her solitary Christmas mornings, with the curtains drawn the way she always left christenings early. It was the town's unspoken agreement. Pretend Lenora Wynne was whole. "How dare you," she whispered. "I ain't trying to hurt you." "Well, you're doing a fine job of it anyway." "I'm trying to be honest. That's the only thing I know how to be." "You don't know anything about me. I know you've been alone for 7 years. I know you walk home from every delivery with your head down and your fists clenched. I know you keep your curtains closed on Christmas morning because you can't stand seeing families through the glass." His voice dropped lower. "And I know you deserve better than what this town gives you. Their gratitude in the daylight and their pity when they think you ain't listening." Lenora's hands were shaking. Not from cold. It was June, and the mountain air was warm with the scent of pine and something sweet along the fence line. She was shaking from the shock of being seen so completely by a man who barely spoke to anyone who lived on a mountain, like something carved from rock, who had apparently been watching her with the same quiet patience he used to study weather patterns and horse behavior and the slow turning of seasons across a landscape he knew better than he knew the inside of any building. "You've been watching me," she said. 3 years. That's unsettling. I know how it sounds, but I ain't a man who makes decisions fast. I needed to be sure. Sure of what? Sure that you're the one I want. The simplicity of it stole her voice. She stood on her porch, clutching her medical bag like a shield, and looked down at this enormous, quiet man who had spent 3 years studying her from a distance before riding down a mountain at midnight to propose marriage with all the romance of a livestock auction. Mr. Cade, I'm a 35-year-old woman who has never been married. Never been with anyone? Never been. She stopped because the next words required a courage she was not sure she possessed. I have never been touched by a man, Mr. Cade. I don't know the first thing about being a wife. I am not what anyone needs. That ain't your decision to make. The response caught her off guard. I beg your pardon. You're telling me what I need. But you don't know what I need. He took one step up, closing the distance between them. She could smell him now. Leather and wood smoke and the clean, cold scent of altitude. I need someone who ain't afraid of hard truth. Someone who can look at blood and suffering and still show up the next morning. Someone who's been broken and put herself back together with her own two hands instead of waiting for someone else to do it. Lenora felt tears burning behind her eyes and hated herself for it. That's a pretty speech for a man who claims he doesn't talk much. A laugh escaped her, broken and unexpected and almost painful. She pressed her hand over her mouth as if she could push it back in. I can't give you children. She said it before she could stop herself, and the words cost her everything she had left. The doctors in Philadelphia said my hands are cursed. Every child I've tried to bring into this world on my own has died. I carry death in my fingers, Mr. Cade. That's not a wife. That's a warning. He was quiet for a long time, long enough for the night sounds to fill the space between them. Crickets in the grass, the gelding breathing, the faint rush of the creek behind the boarding house a quarter-mile away. Then he spoke. Nell told me about the two babies, not your own blood, the ones you delivered, the ones you couldn't save. Nell had no right. She had every right. She loves you, and she's been watching you die by inches for 7 years. Same as I have. His voice went rough as if the words were being dragged over gravel on their way out. I ain't asking you for children. The ride up the mountain took longer than Lenora expected. The trail switched back and forth through rocky ground, and the borrowed mare Nell's old paint horse, with a temperament that suggested she had opinions about altitude, picked her way carefully over loose stone and exposed roots with the cautious deliberation of an animal that understood gravity and respected it. Lenora's medical bag hung from the saddle horn, heavier than usual because it now carried 2 baby blankets alongside the forceps and the tincture bottles, and her small trunk of belongings was strapped behind her, bouncing with every step like a heartbeat she could feel through the leather. She had left Copper Bend before dawn, telling no one except Nell. But Nell being Nell, the whole town probably knew by breakfast. The woman had a gift for discretion that she exercised roughly as often as a rooster exercised silence, which was to say never and under no circumstances. The air changed as the trail climbed, thinner, colder despite the June sun. The pines grew taller and closer together, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the light into long golden shafts that struck the forest floor like pillars in a cathedral built by something older than architecture. Lenora could smell water somewhere close, a creek running fast over stone, and beneath that the deep mineral scent of the mountain itself, the smell of rock that had been rock since before anything alive had thought to name it. The ranch appeared around a sharp bend in the trail, a solid log house tucked into a natural clearing with a barn and a corral and a view that made Lenora's chest tighten for reasons she could not name. The valley opened below like a green hand spread flat against the earth, and beyond it, the peaks of the Continental Divide rose in a line of white and gray and blue that looked less like geography and more like a promise someone had carved into the sky. Silas was standing by the corral fence. She knew from the way he was gripping the top rail that he had been watching the trail since first light. His knuckles were white against the weathered wood, and his body was rigid with the particular tension of a man who had prepared himself for disappointment so thoroughly that the sight of hope approaching on horseback had temporarily broken his ability to move. He did not come to meet her. He just stood there massive and still, like something carved from the mountain itself. You came, he said. I signed the contract. Signing and showing up ain't the same thing. Lenora dismounted and pulled her medical bag free. The mare shook herself with visible relief and wandered toward the water trough without waiting for permission. Well, I'm here. Are you going to help me with my trunk, or are we going to stand here stating facts at each other all morning? Something moved across his face. Relief maybe, or the ghost of a smile, or some emotion too large for his features to contain that leaked out through the cracks in his composure, the way light leaks through the seams of a door. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and lifted her trunk off the horse with one hand like it weighed nothing. Your room's ready, shelves and all. I know, you told Emmett Parrish. I told Emmett Parrish a lot of things. Boy's got a mouth like a church bell. He paused. Did he tell you the part about being the bravest woman I ever knew? He did. I meant it. I know you did. That's why I'm here. He led her inside and Lenore stopped in the doorway of the spare room. The shelves were beautiful. Hand-planed pine sanded smooth as riverstone fitted perfectly into the wall beside a window that caught the morning light. He had built a small table beneath them, just the right height for mixing medicines, and there was a hook by the door for her medical bag. The hook was brass polished bright, and it was set at exactly the height where her bag would hang, without the bottom touching the floor. You measured, she said quietly. Measured what? My bag. These hooks are exactly the right width for my bag. You measured it. Silas shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable, in the way that large men become uncomfortable when caught in an act of tenderness they had hoped would go unnoticed. I might have had Emmett hold it up once while you weren't looking. Lenora pressed her hand against the smooth pine shelf and something cracked inside her chest, not painfully, more like ice breaking on a spring river, the sound of something that had been frozen too long, finally giving way to what moved beneath it. This man had spent weeks preparing a space for her work, her identity, the thing that made her who she was. Dr. Harlan in Philadelphia had spent 3 years trying to make her smaller. Silas Cade had built shelves to make her larger. Thank you, she said, and her voice came out rough. It's just shelves. No, it isn't. They stood in awkward silence until Silas cleared his throat. I reckon we should talk about how this works. Day to day, I mean. I reckon we should. I'm up at 4. Cattle don't care about sleeping. And I'll try to be quiet, but I'm a big man in a small house, so. I'm up at 4, too. Babies don't keep schedules either. Right. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she would come to recognize as his signal for navigating territory he had not mapped. I eat simple. Meat, bread, coffee. I can cook for myself if you don't want to. I'll cook, but you'll eat what I make and I won't hear complaints about vegetables. I don't complain. All men complain about vegetables. I ain't all men. Lenora looked up at him. This wall of a man with gentle eyes and hands that could crush stone, but had sanded shelves smooth as glass for her medicines. No, she said, you're not. The first week passed in a strange dance of 2 people learning each other's rhythms in a space designed for one. Lenore discovered that Silas hummed while he worked, low, tuneless sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, vibrations more than melodies, as if his body produced music the way the mountain produced weather unconsciously and without apology. She discovered he read by firelight every night, working his way through a battered copy of Emerson that had belonged to his mother. The pages were soft as cloth from handling, and certain passages were underlined in pencil, so faint she could barely see the marks, but she could see the places where his thumb had worn the paper thin, from returning to the same lines over and over, the way a man returns to a well when he is thirsty and the water is deep. She discovered he talked to his horses the way she talked to her patients. Calm, steady, honest. He told them what he was going to do before he did it. He apologized when the cinch was too tight. He thanked them at the end of the day with a hand on their necks and a voice so low it was nearly subsonic, and the horses turned their ears toward him, the way flowers turn toward light. Silas discovered that Lenora could not sit still. She organized his kitchen on the 2nd day, his pantry on the 3rd, and by the 4th day she had scrubbed the entire house from floor to ceiling with a ferocity that left him standing in the doorway bewildered. It was clean before he said, "It was clean by your standards. Your standards and mine are having a disagreement. My standards have lived here 12 years without complaint. Your standards didn't have to sleep in that bedroom. There was a cobweb the size of my hand above the window. That was Earl." Lenora stopped scrubbing. "You named a spider. He'd been there since March. Kept the flies down. Earl is gone, Silas. I noticed." His voice was mournful, but his eyes held a warmth that made Lenora's stomach flip in a way she was not prepared for and did not know how to classify. It was not the warmth of gratitude or friendship, or even the cautious regard of 2 people bound by contract. It was something else entirely. Something that lived in the space between what she had agreed to and what she was beginning to want, and the distance between those 2 things was shrinking every day. They did not touch. Not casually, not accidentally, not in any of the small ways that people who share a house inevitably make contact. Silas was careful about space the way a man is careful about something he has spent years learning to respect, because the alternative was loneliness so vast it had its own weather. And Lenora was careful about space because she had never learned how to be anything else. On the fifth day, Emmett Parrish appeared on the trail out of breath and wide-eyed. Lenora heard his boots on the porch and opened the door to find him bent double gasping, his thin chest heaving and his face the color of old flour paste. "Emmett, what's wrong?" "It's Mama. She's bleeding. Down there." His face was white with fear, the fear of a child who understood that the word bleeding carried different weights depending on where it came from and how much of it there was. "She told me to get you, said not to tell nobody else." Lenora grabbed her medical bag without a second thought. Her body moved before her mind caught up muscle memory, and 7 years of training overriding everything else, every doubt and every fear and every stone she carried in her hands, compressed into the single bright purpose of keeping someone alive. "How long?" "Since last night. She tried to hide it, but I saw the rags in the wash basin this morning." "Is she standing?" "Walking. She was lying down when I left." "She looked real scared, Miss Wynne." Silas appeared from the barn, reading the situation instantly, with the economy of a man who had learned in war to assess a crisis in the time it took to draw a breath. "Take my horse, he's faster." Lenora did not argue. She let Silas lift her onto the black gelding, his hands spanning her waist completely, and for one fraction of a second her body registered the heat of his palms, through her dress and the strength of his fingers, and the extraordinary gentleness with which he set her in the saddle, as if she weighed nothing but mattered more than anything. Then she rode down that mountain trail faster than she had ever ridden anything in her life, Emmett clinging to the saddle behind her, with his arms around her waist and his face pressed against her back. Ada Parrish was on her kitchen floor when they arrived. Her nightgown was soaked through with blood, and her face was the color of old candle wax, and her hands were folded over her belly with the protective instinct of a woman who was holding on to something the world was trying to take. Lenora knelt beside her and took her pulse, weak but steady. "How far along?" she asked already, knowing the answer from the curve beneath Ada's gown, that she had been hiding under loose dresses for weeks. 4 months. Ada's voice was thin as paper. "I didn't tell nobody. I thought if I didn't say it out loud, maybe this time." "Hush, I need you quiet and still." Lenora opened her bag and worked with hands that were steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like something caged. 4 months. The words echoed in the hollow space behind her sternum, where she kept the memories she could not afford to examine during daylight hours. 4 months was exactly how far along the banker's wife had been in Philadelphia. 4 months was the border between hope and grief, the invisible line where a pregnancy stopped being a possibility and became a person, and Lenora's hands were the same hands that had crossed that line before and come back empty. But she shoved that recognition into the locked room inside her chest, where she kept everything that could destroy her if she let it out during working hours. She had built that room 7 years ago, and she had reinforced its walls with every successful delivery since. And tonight was not the night it would break open. Tonight her hands belonged to Ada Parrish and the child inside her, and nothing else existed. "Am I losing it?" Ada whispered. "Not if I can help it." Lenora worked for 2 hours. She used every technique she knew, and two she improvised on the spot, her fingers reading Ada's body the way a blind woman reads pages, finding the places where the tension gathered and the blood pooled and the muscles contracted with the desperate, involuntary effort of a body fighting itself. She talked to Ada the entire time. Low, steady words that meant nothing individually, but together formed a rope that Ada could hold on to while the current tried to pull her under. Emmett sat on the porch step silent and terrified, his thin shoulders carrying a weight no 10-year-old should bear. The weight of knowing that the two people he loved most in the world were separated by a wall and a quantity of blood in the uncertain mathematics of survival. When Lenora finally emerged, her hands clean but her apron ruined, she found Silas Cade sitting beside the boy. She did not know when he had come down the mountain. She did not know how he had known. But there he was, his massive frame somehow making itself small enough to sit on Ada Parrish's narrow porch step, his arm around Emmett's shoulders. "She's stable," Lenora said. "The baby's holding, but she needs bed rest, complete bed rest, for at least 2 weeks." Emmett's eyes filled with tears. "Is she going to be okay?" "I'm going to make sure of it." Silas looked up at Lenora and something passed between them. A recognition of shared purpose, of being the kind of people who showed up when others needed them, regardless of the cost to themselves. It was not love, not yet. It was something older and perhaps more durable. The wordless understanding of two soldiers who have found themselves fighting on the same side of a war they did not choose. "I'll bring food up from the ranch," Silas said. "Enough for a week, and I'll send one of my hands to help with their livestock." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His voice was quiet but firm. "I want to." That night, back at the ranch, Lenora sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Silas sat across from her, waiting with that patient silence she was learning to recognize as his way of offering space without abandonment. "She's 4 months along," Lenora said finally. "Same as the first baby I lost, in Philadelphia." Silas did not say anything. He just waited. She told him everything. The cord wrapped 3 times, the 40 minutes of trying, Dr. Harlan's betrayal, the stagecoach in Kansas, and the baby too small to breathe. She told it flat and dry, the way she told medical histories, because that was the only way she could get through it without the words dissolving in her throat. And Silas listened without interrupting, without moving, without doing anything except being present in a way that felt less like patience and more like shelter. "After Kansas, I stopped believing my hands could hold anything alive," she said. "I delivered 43 babies here, and everyone survived, and it still wasn't enough." The silence stretched between them, thick as smoke. Then Silas stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. He did not touch her, just knelt there, this enormous man making himself small, his eyes level with hers. "The man who blamed you was a coward," he said. "A coward who sacrificed the best hands in his hospital to save his own name. Maybe, or maybe he was right. Maybe my hands are." "Don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Don't you ever finish that sentence. Not in this house. Not anywhere I can hear it." His voice shook with a fury that was not directed at her, but at every person and every circumstance that had conspired to make her believe such a thing about herself. "You held Ada Parrish's life in your hands today. You've held half this town's lives in your hands. Your hands are not cursed, Lenora. They are the most capable, most compassionate, most needed hands in 100 miles of mountain." Lenora reached out and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, rough with stubble, warm beneath her palm. It was the first time she had touched anyone with intention in 7 years, and the first time she had touched a man with intention in her entire life. The shock of it went through both of them like lightning through a dry tree. "You're a good man, Silas Cade," she whispered. "I'm trying to be." She pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of how close they were, how the firelight caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, how his breathing had changed. "I should get some rest. I need to check on Ada first thing in the morning. I'll ride down with you." "You don't need to. I want to." He stood, and the moment passed, but something had shifted between them. A wall reduced to rubble. A door cracked open that neither of them could close again even if they wanted to. And the terrifying truth, the one that Lenora carried up the stairs to her separate room and laid beside her on the pillow like a second heartbeat, was that she did not want to. 2 days later, Dr. Harmon Voss arrived in Copper Bend. He came with a leather medical bag twice the size of Lenora's, a diploma from Johns Hopkins framed in gilt, and the confident smile of a man who believed the frontier was a problem that education could solve. He was young, early 30s, with clean hands and a practiced manner that said Eastern Medical School from 20 paces. Lenora was in the general store buying supplies for Ada Parrish when she first heard his name. A real Dr. Mrs. Loomis announced to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the particular ring of vindication that certain people reserve for moments when they believe progress has arrived to confirm their prejudices. A real one with proper training. Mr. Briggs hired him special, said it's time Copper Bend had legitimate medical care. Lenora's hand tightened on the jar of honey she was holding. The word legitimate landed on her like a stone dropped from a height. Mrs. Loomis had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Well, you know what I mean, dear. You've done wonderful work, of course. But you're not actually a doctor, are you? I've delivered every child born in this town for 7 years, and we're grateful. But a real doctor, well, it's progress, isn't it?" Lenora paid for her supplies and walked out without another word. Her jaw ached from clenching, and her chest burned with a fury she had not felt since the night in Philadelphia when Dr. Harlan stood in his office and unmade her career with the calm efficiency of a man canceling a subscription. Silas was waiting with the horses outside the store. He took one look at her face and his expression hardened into something that resembled the leading edge of a storm front. "What happened?" "Dalton Briggs hired a doctor. Apparently I'm not legitimate. That's horse." "Don't." She held up her hand. I know what it is. I know what he's doing. Briggs wants me off balance. Wants me feeling small, so I'll be easier to push around when he comes for your land. Silas's eyes widened slightly. It was the first time either of them had connected Briggs's interest in their marriage to his interest in the ranch, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that settled like a stone in Lenora's stomach. He came to see me, she said, before I accepted your proposal. He talked about your father, about accidents, about history repeating itself. The color drained from Silas's face. The tan that years of mountain weather had burned into his skin seemed to fade from the inside out, leaving something gray and ancient beneath it. He said that. He implied it, carefully, the way men like him always do, friendly enough to deny, ugly enough to understand. Silas turned away from her, and she could see the muscles in his back tighten beneath his shirt, like cables bearing weight. My father went into that mine on a Tuesday morning. Briggs told him there was a new vein worth checking, deep in the north shaft, the shaft that hadn't been reinforced since the previous spring. Silas, they pulled his body out 3 days later. Tunnel collapse. They said bad luck. They said his hands were fists at his sides. Briggs bought his mining claim from my mother for a third of what it was worth while she was still wearing black. She was dead herself within the year. Grief, the doctor said, but I always thought it was something closer to surrender. Lenora moved to stand beside him, not touching. She had learned already that Silas needed space when the darkness came the way a fire needs air to keep burning instead of smothering. But she stood close enough that he could feel her there, close enough that the warmth of her body reached him through the mountain air, and she let the silence hold both of them until he was ready to fill it. How old were you? She asked. 16. And you went up the mountain after that. Enlisted first. Spent 3 years in the war. Watching men die in ways I still can't talk about. Things a boy of 19 should never have seen, and a man of 38 still sees every time he closes his eyes. Then I came home, buried my mother next to my father, and went up the mountain. Figured if I stayed away from people, people couldn't be taken from me. And then you came down for me. He turned to look at her, and the raw need in his eyes made her heart stutter. You were worth coming down for. Lenora took his hand. It was the second time she had touched him with intention, and the first time she had initiated contact that involved holding on rather than letting go. His fingers closed around hers carefully, as if she were something breakable, and she squeezed hard enough to let him know she was not. Dalton Briggs killed your father, she said quietly, and now he's positioning himself to take everything that's left. The new doctor. That's not about medical care. That's about making me disposable. If I'm not needed in town, if I'm just Silas Cade's wife with no purpose of her own, then threatening me becomes easier. I'm leverage instead of a person. Silas stared at her. You figured all that out from one conversation in a general store. I figured it out because I've been underestimated by powerful men before. They all use the same playbook. Make the woman feel small. Take away her purpose. Isolate her from her community. Her grip on his hand tightened. Briggs doesn't know me very well if he thinks that's going to work. No, ma'am, he does not. Then word came 3 days later that confirmed every fear Lenora had assembled from fragments and instinct. A letter arrived at the ranch carried up the mountain by a county clerk on a mule. Official correspondence from the Territorial Office of Health. Dalton Briggs had filed a formal complaint against Lenora Wynn for practicing medicine without a license. Effective immediately, she was barred from providing medical care to any resident of Copper Bend until the matter was reviewed by a territorial board. Lenora read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it on the kitchen table beside Silas's copy of Emerson and said nothing for a very long time. The following Sunday, Silas confronted Briggs at church. Lenora watched from the general store porch as her husband stood before the congregation, filing out of Reverend Aldrich's morning service, and spoke in that low, caring voice that could fill a valley without ever rising above conversational. Briggs, he said. Dalton Briggs turned with his polished smile already in place. The smile of a man who had practiced sincerity until it was indistinguishable from the real thing, unless you knew where to look, and Lenora knew where to look. Silas, Mrs. Wynn, beautiful morning, isn't it? It's Cade now, Lenora said from behind Silas. She had not planned to speak, but the lie of her maiden name on Briggs's lips felt like a violation of something she had only recently begun to claim. I took his name. Of course. Forgive me. What do you want, Briggs? Silas's voice carried no pretense of politeness, just being neighborly. And I wanted to mention I'll be sending a surveyor up to the High Ridge next week. Routine assessment of the old mineral claims. Your mineral claims end at the tree line. The ridge is my land. Well, that's what the survey will determine, won't it? Briggs smiled at Lenora. I'm sure your wife appreciates a man who's thorough about property boundaries. Smart woman like her understands the value of cooperation. My wife Silas said, stepping forward so that his shadow fell across Briggs, like the shadow of something that had been circling overhead and had finally decided to land, appreciates a man who says what he means instead of hiding behind lawyers and surveyors. So let me be clear, set foot on my land without invitation and you'll leave on a stretcher. Briggs's smile did not change, but something behind it went cold and flat like a snake drawing back before it strikes. Careful, Silas. Threats have consequences. So does murder. The word landed like a gunshot in the churchyard. People stopped talking. Reverend Aldrich, halfway to the door, turned around with wide eyes. Even the birds in the cottonwood tree above the church steps went silent, as if the entire mountain had drawn a breath and was holding it. Briggs's face went perfectly still. I don't know what you're implying, he said softly. I ain't implying anything. I'm stating a fact. My father went into your mine healthy and came out dead. You bought his claim for nothing while his widow was still crying, and now you're circling my land like you circled his. Silas's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but it carried across the silent churchyard like thunder carries across a valley. I ain't my father, Briggs. I don't trust easy, and I don't die quiet. Briggs held Silas's gaze for a long moment. Then he straightened his gloves, tipped his hat to Lenora, and walked away without another word. His boots made no sound on the packed earth, the same unnatural silence she had noticed on her porch the day he came to threaten her, as if even the ground had learned to hold its tongue in his presence. The whispers started before his buggy disappeared around the bend. Sharp and fast and electric, the sound of a small town realizing that the ground beneath it had shifted. Nell appeared at Lenora's elbow. Well, that's going to make the next town meeting interesting. He shouldn't have said it, Lenora murmured, watching Silas's back as he walked toward their horses. Not here. Not in public. Maybe not, but someone needed to say it. That man's been choking this town for 20 years and everyone's been too scared or too comfortable to speak up. Nell squeezed her arm. Your husband just lit a match, Lenora. Question is whether it burns Briggs or burns you. That evening, Silas showed Lenora the pocket watch. They sat at the kitchen table with the fire burning low and the mountain darkness pressing against the windows. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy silver timepiece that Lenora had seen him carry but never open. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his hands with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. This was my father's, Josiah Cade. He carried it every day of his life. My mother gave it to him on their wedding day. It was the only thing of value she ever owned, and she gave it away without thinking because that's the kind of woman she was. He opened the case. The face was scratched and the crystal was cracked in one corner, but the mechanism still ticked with a steady, persistent rhythm that filled the quiet kitchen like a second heartbeat. Then Silas reached behind the mechanism with fingers that seemed too large for the delicate work and extracted a folded scrap of paper so small Lenora almost missed it. He held it out to her. 2 lines, written in pencil, the graphite faded but still legible. Briggs changed the inspection date. North shaft not safe. If something happens to me, look in the assay office. J.C. Lenora whispered. Josiah Cade. My father knew. He knew Briggs was sending him into an unsafe shaft, and he wrote this down and hid it in the one thing he knew I'd keep. Silas's voice cracked for the first time since Lenora had known him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small fracture in the bedrock of his composure, a sound like a branch breaking under snow. I found it 6 months after he died. I was 17 and alone and too scared to do anything with it. So I carried it. For 20 years, I carried my father's last words in my pocket and did nothing because I was a coward. You were a boy. I was old enough to fight in a war. I was old enough to ride to the territorial marshal and show him this note and demand an investigation. You were 16 and grieving and alone. That's not cowardice. That's survival. Lenora folded the note carefully, handling it with the same precision she used with her most delicate instruments. And now you're not alone. The note tells us where to look, Silas said. The assay office. That's what Briggs turned into his private office above the general store after my father died. If there's documentation of the inspection fraud, it's in that room. Then that's where we look. Lenora, if he catches us. He's already threatened me. He's already taken my patience and my livelihood and my right to practice the only thing I know how to do. She grabbed his hands, pressing them between hers. What's he going to do, Silas? Make me more angry. She held his gaze until he believed her. Silas, I didn't come up this mountain to hide. I came here to build a life with you. And I am not letting Dalton Briggs take one more thing from this family. Silas looked down at their joined hands. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with something she had not seen before. Not just admiration or affection, but the fierce recognition of an equal. Someone who would stand beside him, not because she needed his protection, but because she had looked at the fight ahead and chosen it. Tomorrow night, he said, Briggs always plays cards at the saloon on Thursdays. He'll be away from the office for at least 3 hours. Then tomorrow night we go. Together. Together. Thursday came with a summer storm that rolled down the mountain in the late afternoon, cracking thunder across the valley and sending rain in sheets against the cabin windows. Lenora took it as a good omen. The noise would cover their approach and the rain would keep people indoors. They rode down after dark, leaving the horses tied in the cottonwood stand behind the church. The town was quiet except for light spilling from the saloon where Briggs's Thursday card game was in full swing. Lenora could hear laughter through the rain, the comfortable laughter of men who believed themselves safe from consequence. Silas moved through the darkness with a silence that should not have been possible for a man his size. Something he had learned in the war, she guessed. Something that lived in his body the way certain skills live in certain people, not as knowledge, but as instinct. The muscle memory of survival in places where being heard meant being found, and being found meant being dead. Desk first, Lenora whispered. Financial records, correspondence, anything with dates matching your father's death. They worked fast. Silas took the desk drawers while Lenora attacked the filing cabinet in the corner. The thunder masked their movements and the rain on the roof created a constant hiss that swallowed small sounds. Lenora found the mind shift logs in the bottom drawer. Leather-bound books going back 30 years. She flipped to August 1858, the month Josiah Cade died, and ran her finger down the entries until she found it. Silas, come here. He was beside her in 2 steps. She held the book open and pointed. The shift log showed Josiah Cade assigned to the north shaft, but the inspection column had been altered. Someone had written cleared over what appeared to be pending. The original ink scraped away but still faintly visible beneath the correction, like a bruise beneath makeup. He changed the record, Silas said. After the collapse, made it look like the shaft had been inspected and cleared. There's more. Lenore turned the page. The inspector's report for the north shaft was dated August 10th, 4 days before the collapse, but the signature at the bottom belonged to Thomas Hartley. Hartley wasn't a mine inspector in '58, Lenore said. He was still in school in Denver. Briggs must have had him sign a backdated report years later to cover the original gap. Silas reached past her and pulled a metal box from behind the filing cabinet. It was locked, but his blade made short work of it. Inside were letters, dozens of them organized by date stretching from 1858 to the present. Lenora's hands trembled as she read the first one. It was from Briggs to a lawyer in Denver discussing the acquisition of Josiah Cade's mining claim and the need to ensure that no questions arise regarding the circumstances of the previous owner's demise. He put it in writing, she breathed. He actually put it in writing. Men like Briggs always think they're too smart to get caught. Silas's voice was rough with 20 years of grief that had finally found its target. They keep records because records mean power, and power is the only thing they understand. They loaded everything into Lenora's medical bag. The shift logs, the letters, the inspector's reports, enough evidence to see Dalton Briggs answer for what he had done. The bag that had carried instruments of healing now carried instruments of justice, and it bore the weight of both without complaint. Lenora was closing the filing cabinet when she heard boots on the stairs outside. Silas moved before she could react. He pulled her behind the desk and pressed them both flat against the wall, his body shielding hers, one hand over her mouth. His heart hammered against her back, and she could feel every muscle in his body coiled tight. The tension of a man who had survived situations exactly like this one by being absolutely still, when stillness was the only thing between living and dying. The door opened. Lamplight spilled across the floor. "I know you're in here," Dr. Harmon Voss's voice tight with nervous energy. "I saw you come in from the saloon window." Silas did not move. Lenora could barely breathe. "I'm not going to call Briggs," Voss continued. "I came because, look, I need to talk to somebody, and you two are the only people in this town who might actually listen." Lenora pulled Silas's hand from her mouth and stepped out from behind the desk. Voss flinched, then steadied himself. His eyes were red, his hands unsteady, and he looked nothing like the confident young doctor who had arrived in Copper Bend 2 weeks ago. "Talk," Lenora said. "Briggs hired me under false pretenses. He told me Copper Ben needed a doctor because the current midwife was unlicensed and putting patients at risk. That was a lie. Voss's voice shook. I've reviewed your case files, Mrs. Cade. Your work is extraordinary. Better outcomes than most hospital physicians I trained under. Get to the point, Silas growled from the shadows. Briggs doesn't want a doctor. He wants a coroner. Voss swallowed hard. 3 days ago, he asked me to sign a medical certificate stating that Josiah Cade's death in 1858 was consistent with natural cardiac failure triggered by physical exertion. A retroactive certificate, backdated to replace the original that apparently went missing from county records last year. Lenora felt the room tilt. He's still covering it up. After 20 years, he's covering it up because he's planning something new. Voss looked directly at Silas. He's been buying up claims and all along the ridge, quietly, through intermediaries. Yours is the last piece he needs. And he told me he was drunk and probably doesn't remember saying it. He told me that the mountain has a way of solving problems that lawyers can't. He's going to kill, Silas, Lenora said. The words came out steady and clinical, the way she spoke when she was assessing a patient's chances, and the numbers were not good. I think he's going to try, and I think he's going to use the mind to do it, same as before. Voss reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This is the certificate he asked me to sign. I haven't signed it, and I'm not going to. Lenora took the paper. One more piece of evidence. Why are you helping us? Silas asked, stepping into the light. Because I became a doctor to save lives, not to help a murderer destroy them. Voss straightened his shoulders with visible effort. And because Ada Parrish is hemorrhaging again. Briggs won't let me send for Mrs. Cade, and I don't have the experience to manage a high-risk pregnancy alone. If that woman dies, her blood is on my hands and his. Lenora was already reaching for her medical bag. Where is she? Camp Infirmary. I can get you in, but it has to be now. Briggs's card game breaks up at 11. Go, Silas said to Lenore. I'll finish here and get the documents to the marshal. The territorial marshal in Silver Junction. That's 4 hours each way. I can make it by morning if I push hard. Lenore grabbed his arm. Silas, if Briggs finds out before you get back. He won't, but if he does. Silas cupped her face in his hands. His palms were warm and rough against her cheeks, and his thumbs traced her cheekbones with a gentleness that made the rest of the world disappear. For one suspended moment, the urgency fell away, and there was nothing in the room but the two of them, and the firelight, and the sound of rain on the roof, and the steady ticking of his father's pocket watch in his coat. I came down that mountain for you, Lenora Wynne. I ain't leaving this world until I've had the chance to love you proper. You hear me? I hear you. Then go save Ada's baby, and I'll go bring the law down on Dalton Briggs like the wrath of the Almighty. He kissed her forehead. Quick, fierce, burning. And then he was gone, moving through the rain with a medical bag full of evidence slung across his back, heading for the cottonwoods where his horse waited. Lenora watched him disappear into the darkness and felt two things simultaneously. The terror of watching someone she loved walk into danger, and the word itself, love, arriving in her chest like a sunrise, unexpected and undeniable, and impossible to look away from. She turned to Voss. Take me to Ada, now. The mine camp was dark and quiet when they arrived. It sat in a narrow gulch east of town, a collection of rough buildings clustered around the mine entrance, like scars around a wound. The rain had turned the ground between the buildings to mud, and the air smelled of wet timber and coal dust, and something metallic that Lenora associated with the places where the earth had been opened against its will. Voss led her through a back entrance to the infirmary, a crude room with 2 cots and a kerosene lamp that threw shadows up the walls like dark hands reaching for the ceiling. Ada Parrish lay on the nearest cot. Her skin was gray, her breathing was shallow. Her nightgown was spotted with fresh blood, and her hands were folded over her belly with the desperate grip of a woman holding the edge of a cliff. Emmett was curled on the floor beside her, asleep with tear tracks still wet on his face. He had positioned himself between his mother and the door, as if his thin body could function as a barrier against whatever was trying to take her from him. His wooden horse, the one Lenora had given him for his 8th birthday, was clutched against his chest. Lenora knelt beside Ada and pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. The pulse was thready, fast, too fast. How long, she asked. Bleeding started 6 hours ago, Voss said. I've tried everything I know. What have you given her? Ergot, willow bark tea. Lenora closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second to absorb the information and calculate its implications and suppress the fury that rose in her chest like a wave. Ergot constricts. She needs the opposite. Her body's fighting the pregnancy, and the ergot is making it fight harder. You've been accelerating the crisis for 6 hours. Voss's face went white. You thought what the textbooks say. Textbooks don't bleed. Lenora opened the kit she had brought and pulled out a small brown bottle. Motherwort tincture. I make it myself. Hold her head up. They worked together. Lenora directing Voss, following her lead, with the humility of a man who had realized in the space of a single night that his diploma was worth less than this woman's hands. Ada drifted in and out of consciousness, moaning softly, her fingers clutching the thin blanket beneath her, as if the fabric could anchor her to a world that was trying to slip away. Stay with me, Ada, Lenora said. Her voice was steady and sure, the voice she had built over 7 years of telling women to breathe and push and hold on, when everything in their bodies was telling them to let go. I didn't ride down a mountain in a thunderstorm to lose you. You hear me? You're going to hold this baby, and you're going to hold Emmett, and you're going to live to see them both grow up. Ada's eyes opened glassy with pain. He told me you wouldn't come. Briggs said you'd abandon us. When have I ever abandoned anyone? Ada's hand found Lenora's and held on with desperate strength. The grip of a woman drowning, reaching for the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. I'm scared. I know, honey, but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. An hour passed, then 2. Emmett woke and sat rigid in the corner, watching Lenora work with eyes that held too much understanding for a boy his age. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply watched with the focused intensity of a child who had learned that the people he loved could be taken without warning, and that the only defense against that taking was vigilance. Voss handed Lenora instruments and cloths and held the lamp steady when her hands were too busy to adjust it. His own hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the second hour, steadied by the rhythm of Lenora's commands and the realization that competence was not a function of credentials, but of presence. At 3:30 in the morning, the bleeding slowed. Ada's color shifted from gray to pale. Her pulse steadied. The baby's heartbeat, which Lenora had been monitoring with her ear pressed against Ada's belly, grew stronger, more regular. The sound of a small life deciding to stay. Lenora sat back on her heels and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. She's stable. The baby's holding. Emmett made a sound, half sob, half laugh, the sound of a 10-year-old boy who had been prepared to lose everything, discovering that everything was still here. He scrambled across the floor and pressed his face against his mother's shoulder, and Ada's arm came around him weakly, and she looked at Lenora with eyes full of something that went beyond gratitude into a territory that had no name, because language had not yet found a way to describe what one woman owes another who has saved her child's life twice. You came, Ada whispered. I'll always come. Voss touched Lenora's arm. Mrs. Cade, what you just did, the way you managed that crisis, I couldn't have done it, not with 10 more years of training. Then maybe stop letting Briggs decide who's legitimate and who isn't. A noise outside made them all freeze. Boots on gravel. Voices. The heavy, deliberate sound of men who were not trying to be quiet because they believed they owned the ground they walked on. Then the infirmary door banged open, and Dalton Briggs stood in the frame. He was rain-soaked and furious. His silver hair was plastered to his skull, and his gentleman's gloves were dark with water, and his face held an expression that Lenora had seen before in Philadelphia on the face of Dr. Harlan, the night he decided to destroy her career. The expression of a man who had discovered that the world contained a variable he had not accounted for and intended to eliminate it. 2 armed men stood behind him, mine workers, thick-necked, holding rifles with the casual familiarity of men who had been told they might need them. His eyes swept the room, Ada on the cot, Emmett clutching her, Voss standing with bloody hands, and Lenora on her knees with her sleeves rolled up and defiance blazing in every line of her body. Get out, Briggs said. His voice was low and shaking with rage. Get out of my camp. Lenora stood slowly. She did not hurry. She had learned a long time ago that powerful men expected women to move quickly when commanded, and that refusing to do so was itself a form of resistance that cost nothing and gained everything. She straightened her back. She rolled down her sleeves with the deliberate calm of a woman who had decided exactly how this moment would end and was not interested in alternatives. No, this is my property. You're trespassing. This is a medical emergency. I'm a healthcare provider treating a patient in crisis. Touch me, and every newspaper from here to Denver will know that Dalton Briggs let a pregnant woman bleed to death because his pride mattered more than her life. Briggs' face contorted. You think anyone cares about one miner's widow? I think everyone cares about a mother and her baby. especially when the man responsible for her suffering is the same man who killed her neighbor in an unsafe mine shaft 20 years ago. The words hit Briggs like a physical blow. His gaze darted to Voss, who flinched but did not look away. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Voss said. His voice cracked but held. "Something this town has needed for a long time." Briggs's hand moved toward his hip, and Lenora saw the glint of a pistol grip beneath his coat. The room went very still, the kind of still that exists in the space between a match being struck and the flame catching. "Touch that gun and I'll break your arm." The voice came from the doorway, and everyone turned. Silas Cade filled the frame like a wall of flesh and fury. His clothes were soaked through. His dark hair was plastered to his skull. His chest heaved from riding, and his eyes held something that made Briggs's armed men take a step backward without being told. It was not anger. It was something colder and more precise. The focused intent of a man who had calculated every possible outcome of the next 30 seconds and was prepared for all of them. He was not alone. Behind him stood a man Lenora did not recognize. Tall, lean, wearing a territorial marshal's badge that caught the lamplight like a small silver star. "Dalton Briggs," the marshal said, stepping past Silas with his hand on his sidearm. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. You will surrender your weapon and come with me quietly." Briggs's mask crumbled. 20 years of careful construction. The polished smile, the reasonable voice, the gentleman's gloves. All of it fell away, and underneath was something small and desperate and vicious. The face of a man who had built his life on a dead man's bones and had always known somewhere beneath the polish that the bones would not hold forever. "You can't prove anything," he snarled. "Your own letters prove everything," Silas said. He stepped into the room, and Briggs pressed himself against the wall. Every document, every forged inspection, every backdated report. You kept records of your own crimes because you thought nobody would ever be brave enough to come looking. That evidence was stolen. That evidence was recovered from the office of a murderer by the son of his victim. The marshal finds it compelling. The marshal's men moved in. Briggs struggled briefly, pathetically, the flailing of a man who had relied on other people's strength for so long that he had forgotten he had none of his own. The handcuffs closed around his wrist with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. As they let him out, Briggs turned one last time and looked at Lenora with pure hatred. "You should have stayed in Philadelphia, and you should have left that mine shaft alone." She held his gaze until he was dragged through the door and into the rain. Then her legs gave out. She sat on the infirmary floor beside Ada's cot and pressed her hands over her face, and the shaking she had been holding back for hours came all at once. Deep, racking tremors that rattled her teeth and blurred her vision and made her body feel like something that had been held together by wire and will and was finally being allowed to come apart. Silas was there in an instant. He dropped to his knees and gathered her against his chest, wrapping himself around her like he could shield her from the aftermath of everything they had just survived. His arms were enormous and warm, and they closed around her with a gentleness that contradicted their size, the way a whisper contradicts a shout. "It's over," he said into her hair. "Lenora, it's over. Is Ada safe?" "She's safe. Emmett's safe. Everyone's safe. Your father's going to get justice." His arms tightened. "Because of you. Because you found the pattern and followed the evidence and refused to let a powerful man make you feel small." Lenora pressed her face against his shirt and breathed him in. Sweat and rain and hoarse, and something underneath that was just Silas, warm and solid in hers. "I love you," she said. The words came out without planning, without rehearsal, without the careful consideration she applied to everything else in her life. They just fell out of her as natural and necessary as breathing, as inevitable as the sunrise that was beginning to lighten the sky beyond the infirmary window. Silas went still. His heartbeat thundered against her ear. "Say it again." "I love you, Silas Cade. Not because of the contract, not because of the ranch, because you built shelves for my medicines and sent a rabbit through a 10-year-old boy and came down a mountain at midnight for a woman you thought was worth the ride." His eyes were wet. This man who had spent half his life learning to survive alone and the other half learning that alone was not the same as strong. He was crying, and he did not try to hide it. And that, more than the words, more than the kiss, more than anything that had happened in the long dark hours of this impossible night, was what told Lenora that everything had changed. "I have loved you," he said, his voice breaking on every word, "since the first time I saw you walk out of a birthing room with blood on your hands and kindness in your eyes." 3 years, Lenora. I have loved you for 3 years and never once believed I'd get to hear you say it back. He kissed her, not on the forehead, not on the knuckles. He kissed her mouth with a gentleness that made her chest ache, and a desperation that made her hands shake, and a reverence that made her understand for the first time in her life what it meant to be held by someone who had been waiting for the privilege. And Lenora kissed him back. Her first kiss. At 35 years old, on the floor of a mining camp infirmary, with blood on her apron and tears on her face, and the sound of rain on the roof, and a sleeping boy in the corner, and a woman and her unborn child alive on the cot beside them, because her hands, her supposedly cursed hands, had held them in this world one more time. She had waited 35 years for this, not because she had been saving herself for someone specific, but because she had never believed anyone would want what she was. A woman with calloused hands and a scarred heart in a medical bag full of instruments and grief and 2 baby blankets that smelled like wool and loss. And here was this man, this mountain, this impossible, gentle giant kissing her like she was the answer to a question he had spent his entire life trying to ask. I've never done this before, she whispered when they broke apart. Any of this. I know. His thumb traced her lower lip with a tenderness that made her shiver. Neither have I. We'll learn together. The echo of his words from the night he proposed hit them both at the same time. The same promise spoken twice, meaning more the second time, because now they understood what they were promising. Emmett's voice cut through the moment with 10-year-old precision. Are they kissing, Mama? Ada Parrish, barely conscious, but apparently alert enough to appreciate the situation, laughed weakly. Hush, baby, let them have this. They brought Ada and Emmett home to the ranch before the sun cleared the ridge. Silas drove the wagon himself. He had filled the bed with every blanket and pillow from their house, creating a nest so deep and soft that Ada barely felt the switchbacks as the trail climbed. Voss helped Lenora transfer Ada to the wagon, his hands competent, now steadied by a night that had burned away his arrogance and left something useful in its place. You should come too, Lenora told him. Briggs's men are still in that camp. When they find out their boss has been arrested, some of them might decide to settle scores. Voss looked at the camp around him. The rough buildings, the suspicious faces of miners emerging for their morning shift. The realization that he had chosen a side and the side he had not chosen had rifles. I don't have a horse. Ride with Emmett. Silas's gelding can carry 3 men your size without noticing. The ride up the mountain was slow and careful. Silas drove the wagon with his eyes fixed on every rut and stone, taking each switchback at a pace that would have tried a saint's patience. Lenora rode beside the wagon, one hand on the rail, watching Ada's face for any sign of distress. Emmett rode behind them on the black gelding, with Voss clinging to the saddle behind him. The boy handled the massive horse with a confidence that made Lenora's chest ache with pride and something deeper. Something that felt like motherhood, whether her body had earned the title or not. They reached the ranch by mid-morning. Silas carried Ada inside as if she weighed nothing, his huge arms gentle beneath her, his stride smooth enough that she did not wake. He laid her in Lenora's bed, their best mattress, their cleanest sheets, and stood there for a moment looking down at this fragile woman who had been used as a weapon against the people trying to protect her. Nobody's taking her again, he said quietly. Not while I'm breathing. Lenora touched his arm. I know. Emmett appeared in the doorway clutching his wooden horse. His eyes were enormous, and Lenora could see the war happening behind them. The child who wanted to cry fighting the boy who had been told that tears were weakness, the way boys were always told that the truest things they felt were the things they should hide. Come here, sweetheart, Lenora said. Emmett crossed the room in 3 steps and buried his face against her waist. She held him while his thin shoulders shook and Silas's hand came to rest on the boy's head, heavy and warm and protective. You're safe now, son, Silas said. The words slipped out naturally, unplanned, as inevitable as the sunrise that was now pouring through the window and filling the room with the golden light of a morning that had been earned by a night that nearly broke them all. Lenora watched Emmett's whole body react to it, a shudder of relief so deep it seemed to come from his bones. Can I stay? Emmett's voice was muffled against Lenora's dress. Not just tonight. Can I stay for real? Lenora looked at Silas over Emmett's head. His expression held the question he could not ask out loud. The same question she had been carrying in her heart since the first time this fatherless boy had shown up on her porch with a dead rabbit and a message from a mountain man who was too shy to deliver it himself. For as long as you want, Lenora said. For as long as your mama says it's okay. Forever, Emmett said. I want to stay forever. Silas's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder, and his face changed. 20 years of solitary grief cracked open, and something warm rushed through the fracture, filling spaces that had been empty so long he had forgotten they existed. The trial in Silver Junction lasted 4 days. Lenora and Silas made the journey together, leaving Emmett with Ada and Nell. They rode side by side down the mountain and across the valley with the evidence packed in Lenora's medical bag, the same bag that had carried instruments of healing and tools of justice with equal purpose. Briggs looked diminished in the courtroom. His Denver lawyer argued every point with expensive precision, challenging evidence, questioning motives, painting Silas and Lenora as opportunists who had targeted a successful businessman out of jealousy. Lenora sat through it with her hands folded and her jaw set. Silas sat beside her, rigid, his father's pocket watch gripped in his fist beneath the table. On the second day, the prosecution called a surprise witness, Obadiah Skaggs, a retired miner 72 years old who shuffled to the stand with the careful steps of someone whose body had been broken by decades underground. His back was bent at an angle that spoke of tunnels too low for standing and loads too heavy for carrying and years too many for counting. His hands were gnarled into shapes that no longer resembled the hands of a young man who had once believed the mountain would make him rich. But his eyes were clear, and his voice when he spoke carried the steady conviction of a man who had been waiting 20 years to say what he was about to say. I was there the morning Josiah Cade went into the North Shaft, Skaggs said. Briggs told him there was a new vein worth checking. I told Josiah the timbers looked wrong, said we should wait for the inspector. Briggs pulled me aside and told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep working. And what happened next, the prosecutor asked. I heard the collapse from the surface. Sounded like God himself was breaking the mountain apart. Skaggs's hands trembled on his knees, but his voice did not waver. Briggs was standing right beside me. He didn't even flinch. Just checked his watch and said, well, that's unfortunate, like a man who'd lost a hand of cards, not a man whose worker had just died. The courtroom erupted. Briggs's lawyer demanded a recess. The judge denied it. Why didn't you come forward before now, the prosecutor asked. Skaggs looked directly at Briggs. The old man's eyes held no hatred, only the weary clarity of someone who had carried a truth so long it had become part of his skeleton. Because he paid me $200 to leave town the next day. Told me if I ever came back to Colorado, I'd end up in a shaft of my own. The old man straightened in his chair with the dignity of someone finally laying down a burden they had carried for so long it had reshaped their spine. I've been living with that money and that shame for 20 years. I spent that money in a month. The shame lasted every day since. When I heard what happened in Copper Bend, what that woman did, the midwife who wouldn't back down, he turned and looked at Lenora. His eyes were wet and his gnarled hands gripped his knees, and his voice carried across the silent courtroom like a confession spoken not to a judge, but to the ghost of a man who had died in the dark 20 years ago. I figured if she could be brave enough to face him, so could I. I owed that to Josiah. I owed it to his boy, and I owed it to myself. Lenora felt Silas's hand find hers under the table. His grip was crushing, and she squeezed back just as hard. Briggs's lawyer attacked Lenora on the stand. His tone carried the practiced condescension of a man who had made a career of making women feel small in public spaces. Mrs. Cade, you're not a trained investigator. You're not a lawyer. You're not even a licensed physician. On what authority do you present yourself as an expert in fraud detection? Lenora looked at him the way she looked at a breech birth, with calm focus and absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. I'm a woman who spent 7 years looking people in the eye and knowing whether they're telling the truth. I've held dying men's hands and delivered babies that weren't breathing and told mothers their children were sick when every instinct in me wanted to lie. I don't need a license to recognize when a man is covering up murder. I just need eyes and a conscience. The courtroom went silent. The lawyer sat down. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Briggs was found guilty of murder in the first-degree fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. The judge's voice was measured and final, the voice of a system that moved slowly but moved nonetheless. Briggs stood for sentencing with his shoulders hunched, his gloves gone, his veneer stripped away to reveal the smallness beneath. As the deputies moved to take him, he turned and looked at Lenora one final time. She expected hatred. Instead, she saw exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man who had spent 20 years maintaining a lie and had finally been allowed to stop. You were right, he said. His voice was barely audible. About my conscience. Then they took him away, And Silas pressed his father's pocket watch against his heart and wept for the first time since he was 16 years old. Lenora put her arm around him and held him in the courtroom while the gallery emptied and the judge collected his papers and the afternoon light came through the tall windows and fell across them both like a benediction from something that did not require a name. They stayed in Silver Junction that night. In a small hotel room with a creaking bed and thin walls, Silas laid his head in Lenora's lap and told her about his father. Not the facts she already knew, but the memories. How Josiah Cade had taught him to ride by putting him on a horse before he could walk. How his father had read to him every night from a battered book of Emerson's essays that had belonged to his own mother. How the last thing Josiah ever said to his son was, "Take care of the mountain, boy. It'll take care of you." He was right, Lenora said, running her fingers through Silas's hair. The mountain brought you to me. The mountain didn't do anything. You came to it. We both did. Two broken people running from different things ending up in the same place. Not broken anymore. No, not anymore. They rode home the next morning. Copper Ben met them at the town line. Not just Nell and Emmett and Ada, but the miners and their families, the shopkeepers, Reverend Aldrich, even Mrs. Loomis, who had apparently undergone a conversion from disapproving neighbor to enthusiastic supporter, somewhere between the arrest and the verdict. Emmett reached them first, sprinting ahead of the crowd to grab Silas's stirrup and run alongside the horse. Did they get him? Is it over? It's over, son, Silas said, and the word came as naturally as breathing now. Emmett's face was fierce. Good. He hurt my mama. He hurt everybody. Silas dismounted and knelt in front of the boy. Emmett, listen to me. What Briggs did was evil and he's paying for it. But I don't want you carrying hate around like a stone in your pocket. It'll weigh you down until you can't move forward. You understand? Is that what happened to you? On the mountain? Silas looked at this boy who saw everything, understood everything, and feared nothing. That's exactly what happened to me. And it took a very stubborn woman to make me put the stone down. Lenora. Emmett looked between them with the rapid calculation of a child who had learned to read adults the way other children read books. Then he threw his arms around Silas's neck. I'm glad she made you come down. Me too, son, me too. Silas rebuilt Copper Bend the way his father would have wanted. He stood before the displaced miners in the town square. 40-odd men who had lost their livelihoods when the mine shut down and their families standing behind them. Women with children on their hips and worry etched into their faces, and the particular exhaustion of people who had been living under one man's thumb for so long, they had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Silas spoke in that low, carrying voice. I ain't gonna lie to you. Briggs is gone, and he ain't coming back. The mine's future is uncertain, and I know that scares you because it ought to scare you. A man who isn't scared when the ground shifts beneath him isn't brave. He's foolish. But this town was here before Briggs, and it'll be here after him. The question is, what we build on the ground he left behind. Easy for you to say, shouted Walt Brennan. You've got land and cattle. We've got nothing without that mine. You've got skills, you've got strong backs, and you've got each other. Silas held up his hand. I can't replace Briggs's payroll, but I can offer work to any man willing to learn ranching. The ridge has timber water and grazing land that's never been properly developed. There's enough up there to support a dozen families if we work it right. You'd share your land. I'd share the work. My father believed this mountain could sustain a community, not just one man's fortune. Briggs killed him for that belief. I intend to prove my father right. Walt Brennan spat in the dust, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. I don't know nothing about cattle. Neither did I once. When do we start? Tomorrow. Sun up. Bring your own tools and an empty stomach. My wife cooks enough for an army. Lenora raised an eyebrow at this volunteering of her kitchen, but the laughter that rippled through the crowd was the best sound she had heard since riding up the mountain with a signed contract in her pocket. Lenora opened her clinic in the front room of the ranch house, treating injuries and mountain ailments alongside her midwifery. Voss joined her as her student, not her replacement, learning the practical frontier medicine that no Eastern school could teach. He held needles the wrong way, and she corrected him. He measured doses by the book, and she taught him to measure by the patient. And slowly, week by week, the young doctor who had arrived in Copper Bend as a weapon became something useful, something honest, something that Lenora could look at without seeing the man who had been sent to replace her. The weeks that followed transformed Copper Bend in ways nobody had predicted. Silas's offer of work drew not just the displaced miners, but families from neighboring valleys who had heard about Briggs's downfall and sensed opportunity. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the mine's constant rumble as the dominant rhythm of the town. Houses went up on the ridge. Fences stretched across meadows that had never been fenced. And the mountain, which had been dying under Briggs's extraction, began to show signs of the kind of life that comes when the land is worked with rather than worked against. Ada grew stronger daily under Lenora's care. The bleeding did not return. The baby, a girl they believed, grew with the stubborn persistence of a mountain wildflower pushing through rock. Nellie organized the second wedding. She appeared at the ranch one morning with Reverend Aldrich Ada, who had no business being out of bed, but was sitting up, looking pleased with herself, Voss Brennan and Emmett. Lenora came downstairs to find them all packed into her kitchen. "What is this?" she asked. "This," Nell said, rising with the authority of a woman who had been orchestrating other people's happiness for 60 years, "is an intervention." An intervention for what? For two people who got married without a proper wedding and are clearly too stubborn to fix that on their own. Nell gestured at Reverend Aldrich, who had the decency to look embarrassed. "The Reverend's here. The witnesses are here. Ada made a cake. Don't ask me how. The woman's supposed to be horizontal." Lenora opened her mouth to protest, but Silas's hand landed on her shoulder from behind. She turned. He was dressed barely. His shirt untucked, his hair wild, his feet bare on the wooden floor. He looked at the assembled group, then down at Lenora, and his expression held the question. "You said you wanted to marry me again," Lenora said quietly. "Looks like the mountain had the same idea. I wanted it to be just us. Nothing in our life has ever been just us. And I don't think I'd want it to be." She took his hand. "These are our people, Silas. Every one of them is here because of what we built together. Let them see it." Reverend Aldrich performed the ceremony between the stove and the table, where Lenora and Silas had planned their raid on Briggs' office. There were no flowers, no music, no formal attire. Silas was barefoot. Lenora's hair was still half braided from sleep. Emmett stood as ring bearer, holding the pocket watch because they had no ring to exchange. "Do you, Silas Cade, take this woman?" "I do. I did the first time. I'll do it every morning for the rest of my life if she'll let me." Reverend Aldrich blinked. "I hadn't finished the question." "Didn't need to." Laughter filled the kitchen. Lenora pressed her lips together to keep from crying, but her eyes gave her away. "And do you, Lenore?" "Yes, ma'am, I really do need to finish the..." "Yes to everything." "To all of it, yes." More laughter. Emmett bounced on his toes. Ada wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Nell looked like a woman who had won every wager she had ever placed. Silas cupped Lenora's face in his hands, those enormous, scarred, impossibly gentle hands. "Take my name, Lenora Wynne." The words echoed in the kitchen like a bell. The same words he had not quite said on her porch at midnight. The words that had been waiting beneath every conversation and every silence, and every shelf he had built, and every rabbit he had sent, and every hour he had spent watching the trail for a woman he believed was worth the wait. "I'll take it," she said. He kissed her with the whole room watching. Emmett made gagging noises. Brennan studied the ceiling. Voss clapped once awkwardly and stuffed his hands in his pockets. "Hello, wife." "Hello, husband. This time I mean it. You meant it last time, too. You just didn't know it yet." Ada's cake was lopsided and slightly burned on one side, and Lenora declared it the best thing she had ever eaten. They sat around the kitchen table elbow to elbow, passing plates and talking over each other the way families do when they have forgotten to be polite because they are too busy being happy. Nell told stories about Lenora's first year in Copper Bend, including the time she delivered the Henderson twins during a blizzard by candlelight and then walked 3 miles home through waist-deep snow because she refused to impose on anyone's hospitality. Silas listened with the expression of a man learning the history of a country he had just become a citizen of. Voss ate 3 pieces of cake and said nothing, which was the most sociable anyone had ever seen him. And Lenora looked at this unlikely family she had assembled and felt something expand in her chest that was too big for any word she knew. It was not happiness, though. Happiness was part of it. It was not relief, though relief lived at its edges. It was the sensation of arriving at a place she had not known she was traveling toward, of opening a door she had not known existed, and finding on the other side everything she had spent 7 years convincing herself she did not deserve. Emmett tugged her sleeve. "Does this mean I can call you Mama now?" The table went quiet. Every adult stopped breathing. Lenora looked at this boy, thin and dirty and brave and fatherless, who had carried messages and ridden horses and slept on infirmary floors and never once complained, who had chosen her the same way she had chosen him, the same way Silas had chosen them all. If your mama says it's okay, Lenora whispered. All eyes turned to Ada. She was crying openly now, her hand on her belly, where her daughter grew, and she nodded once, sharp and certain. She'd be honored, and so would his father. Emmett threw his arms around Lenora's neck so hard he nearly knocked her off her chair. She held him with the fierce, desperate tenderness of a woman who had spent 7 years with empty arms and was never, ever letting go. His thin body pressed against hers, and she could feel his heartbeat fast and strong and trusting. And she thought about the night she had delivered this boy into the world 10 years ago, 3 weeks after the mountain took his father. She had placed him in Ada's arms and walked home alone and cried until her throat was raw. And now he was here in her arms, calling her the name she had never believed she would hear. Silas's hand found the back of her neck and rested there. Warm, steady, present. The weight of it was the weight of everything he had promised on her porch at midnight and everything he had delivered since. She leaned into his touch and let the tears fall because they were not grief anymore. They were gratitude so deep it had no bottom. Only a surface that kept expanding to hold everything she had been given by a world she had spent 7 years refusing to trust. On a Tuesday morning in late September, with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainside and the air carrying the first sharp bite of autumn, Lenora woke up sick. Not the kind of sick she had been treating in other people for 7 years. A different kind, a familiar kind. The kind she had read about in textbooks and witnessed in patients and never once experienced in her own body. She made it to the basin before she lost everything in her stomach. Then she sat on the bedroom floor with her back against the wall and her hand pressed flat against her abdomen. No, she whispered. Don't you dare hope. Don't you dare. Silas found her there 10 minutes later. He dropped to his knees so fast she heard them crack against the wooden floor. Lenora, what's wrong? Are you hurt? I'm fine. You're on the floor. I'm fine, Silas. You're crying and you're on the floor. Those two things together have never once meant fine in the history of the word. She looked at him, this giant, gentle, impossible man who had ridden down a mountain for her, and she could not hold it in anymore. I think I'm pregnant. Silas Cade, who had faced down murderers without flinching, who had testified in court with steady hands and a clear voice, who had survived a war and 20 years of solitary grief, went completely white and sat down on the floor beside her with a thud that shook the house. Say that again. I think I'm pregnant. I'm late. I'm sick. She pressed both hands against her stomach. Silas, I'm terrified. The doctors said my hands were cursed. What if my body is too? What if the doctors didn't know you? His voice cracked. The doctors didn't know what your hands can do, what your body can do, what you can do. What if it happens? What if I lose? Then we face it together. Same as everything else. He pulled her against his chest, and she could feel his heart hammering like a horse at full gallop. But Lenora, what if it doesn't happen? What if this time is different? I'm afraid to believe that. I know. I was afraid to believe I could come down from that mountain. I was afraid to believe you'd sign that contract. I was afraid to believe you could love me. His arms tightened. Being afraid doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it means you're about to get the thing you wanted most. She told no one for the first 2 months. Only Silas knew, and he guarded the secret with the fierce protectiveness he applied to everything he loved. He watched her without hovering, adjusted her workload without being asked, made sure she ate even when the nausea made food seem impossible. At 8 weeks, she told Voss. He examined her with careful hands and honest eyes. Everything looks good. Strong pulse. No spotting. Your body is handling this well. My body has never done this before. Your body has never had this before. Voss met her gaze. A ranch, a husband who would walk through fire for you, a community that needs you, peace. You're not the same woman who arrived in Copper Bend 7 years ago, and this is not the same body. At 12 weeks, she told Nell. The older woman sat down hard in her boarding house kitchen and cried for 10 minutes without stopping. I knew it, Nell said when she could speak. I knew it the morning after your real wedding. You had a look about you. What kind of look? The look of a woman who's finally stopped running from her own life. Nell blew her nose into a handkerchief the size of a dinner napkin and fixed Lenora with a gaze that was equal parts joy and warning. You listen to me, Lenora Cade. You are going to take care of yourself. You are going to rest when your body tells you to rest and eat when it tells you to eat, and you are not going to deliver anyone else's baby after your 7th month. Voss can handle it. That's what you trained him for. You can't tell me what to do, Nell. I have been telling you what to do for 7 years. And you have been ignoring me for 7 years, and look where it got you. married to the best man in Colorado with a baby on the way. So maybe start listening. Lenora laughed. The sound surprised her every time it came now. This easy laughter that had been absent from her life for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like in her throat. At 14 weeks, Ada went into labor. Lenora was at her side from the first contraction, her hands steady, her voice calm, while inside her own body another life was growing. Proof that broken things could mend, that verdicts could be overturned, that the story was not over just because someone had written the ending too soon. Ada's daughter arrived at sunset, screaming with the full-throated fury of a child who intended to be heard. The sound filled the ranch house and spilled out through the open window and carried across the ridge where the aspens were burning gold against the blue September sky. Lenora placed the baby in Ada's arms and stepped back. And for the first time in her career, she did not feel the knife twist of envy. She felt joy, pure, uncomplicated, overflowing. Because this time, her arms were not empty. This time, there was a life growing inside her own body, proof that the story she had told herself for 7 years, the story of cursed hands and a barren future, had been wrong. Not a lie exactly, just a story written by the wrong author. She's perfect, Ada whispered. She's loud, Emmett observed from the doorway. She's both, Lenora said. That's the best combination. Ada looked up at Lenora with knowing eyes. You're showing. Lenora's hand went to her belly where the slight curve was just beginning to press against her dress. I was going to tell you after. I know. Ada's smile was radiant. Our girls are going to grow up together. We don't know it's a girl. I know. 5 months later, on a February morning when the snow lay deep across Copper Bend and the mountain wore a crown of ice, Lenora Wynne gave birth to a son. The labor started before dawn. Lenora woke Silas with a hand on his chest and 2 words. It's time. He was out of bed and dressed before she finished the sentence, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who had been preparing for this moment the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, quietly, and with a fear so deep he had to bury it beneath purpose to keep it from paralyzing him. Nellie arrived within the hour, summoned by some instinct that Lenora suspected had less to do with maternal wisdom and more to do with the fact that Nell had been sleeping in the boarding house with one eye open for the past 3 weeks. Voss came shortly after, his medical bag in one hand and a look on his face that said he understood exactly how much was at stake and was terrified of being the person responsible if anything went wrong. But it was Silas who delivered the baby. Lenora had decided this weeks ago and had told him so with the matter-of-fact certainty of a woman who had spent her entire adult life placing children into the arms of other people and wanted just once to have her child placed into the arms of the man she loved by the hands of the man she loved. Silas delivered the baby himself. His hands were shaking. His face was ashen. His voice was steady only because Lenora was steady first. You're doing this, she told him through gritted teeth. Don't you dare faint on me, Silas Cade. I ain't fainting, I'm praying. Pray faster. The baby came into the world with a cry that rattled the windows, and Silas caught his son with hands that had broken horses and fought for justice and built shelves for a woman's medicine bag and held the evidence that freed a town from 20 years of tyranny. He held the boy up to the light, and his face, that weathered, guarded, beautiful face, broke open like a dam. He's here, Silas said. Lenora, he's here. Lenora reached for her son, and when he was placed against her chest, she felt the last locked door inside her swing wide. The door she had built in Philadelphia. The door she had reinforced in Kansas. The door she had guarded for 7 years in Copper Bend with the fierce vigilance of a woman who believed that what lived behind it would destroy her if she ever let it out. The door opened, and what came through was not destruction, but light. Not the light of a lamp or a sunrise, but the light of a life that her body had made and her hands had received and her heart had been waiting for since before she knew she had one. The room was full. Nell, Voss, Ada with her baby girl on her hip, Emmett pressed against Silas's side, all of them crying, all of them laughing, all of them home. What's his name? Emmett asked. Lenora looked at Silas. He nodded once. Samuel. Samuel Josiah Cade. Emmett's face lit up. Like Grandpa. Like Grandpa. Silas knelt beside the bed and pressed his forehead against his son's. This tiny, perfect, impossible child who existed because 2 lonely people had been brave enough to sign a contract and foolish enough to fall in love. Welcome to the mountain, Samuel. You've got a mama who won't quit, a brother who'll teach you to ride, and a father who came down from the clouds for the woman who taught him how to live. He kissed his son's forehead. You were worth the wait. All of it. Every year, every mile, every single lonely night. Lenora pulled Silas close until all three of them were tangled together. Husband, wife, son, Emmett climbed onto the bed without asking permission and pressed himself against Silas's side, and Ada stood in the doorway with her daughter on her hip and tears running freely down her face, and Nell sat in the rocking chair by the window and rocked and wept and smiled and looked like a woman who had finally been given the ending she had been writing in her head for 7 years. Voss stood apart from the rest of them, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed and his eyes bright. He was not family, not yet. But he was something adjacent to it, something that had been forged in the same fire, and Lenora caught his eye and nodded once, and he nodded back, and the gesture contained more gratitude than either of them would ever find words for. Outside the window, Copper Bend was alive with the sounds of a town rebuilt from the ashes of one man's greed by the stubborn, impractical, magnificent love of two people who had found each other at the end of the world and made it new. Hammers rang in the cold air. Smoke rose from chimneys that had been dark for years. Children played in the snow between houses that had been empty 6 months ago and were now full of the noise and mess and warmth that happened when people decided to stay instead of leave. The pocket watch sat on the bedside table, its face catching the winter light, still ticking after all these years. Josiah Cage's legacy, not the land, not the mine, not the mountain, but the simple radical belief that love was worth coming down for, that a community was worth building, that a man's life mattered not because of what he accumulated, but because of what he left behind in the hearts of the people who remembered him. And Lenora, who had buried 2 small failures and a broken career and crossed 3 states to find a place where she could stop running, finally closed her eyes. She held her living son against her beating heart, and she knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she was always meant to be. Not because a contract told her so, not because a mountain man proposed at midnight, but because she had chosen this life with open eyes and steady hands and a courage she did not know she had until someone believed in it before she did. That was the truth of it. That was the whole story. Not a story about rescue, not a story about a man saving a woman or a woman saving a man. A story about 2 people who had been alone for so long, they had forgotten that alone was a choice and not a sentence. 2 people who had carried their grief up a mountain and down a mountain and across 3 states and through 20 years of silence and had finally set it down. Not because the grief stopped mattering, but because they found something that mattered more. Love did not rescue Lenora Wynne. Lenora Wynne rescued herself, and then she let Silas Cade walk beside her, not ahead, not behind, but right there at her shoulder into a future that was better than anything she had ever dared to dream.